In a small village nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests, where morning mist clung to cobblestone streets like whispered secrets, there lived a clockmaker named Edmund whose shop stood at the corner of the oldest square in town, its wooden sign creaking gently in the evening breeze, painted with faded gold letters that spelled simply timekeeper, above an intricate illustration of gears and springs that seemed to move when caught by the setting sun. The shop itself was a narrow building, 3 stories tall, with windows that glowed amber long after other merchants had closed their doors, and those who passed by late at night could hear the symphony of ticking, a chorus of hundreds of clocks marking the passage of moments in perfect, overlapping harmony that created a sound like rainfall on distant leaves. Edmund had inherited this shop from his grandfather, who had received it from his own father, a lineage of craftsmen stretching back through generations, each one adding to the collection of timepieces that filled every available surface, from grandstanding clocks with faces painted with celestial maps to tiny pocket watches no larger than a child's fist, their mechanisms so delicate that assembling them required tweezers and a magnifying glass mounted on a flexible brass arm. The clockmaker himself was a man of 60 years, with silver hair that swept back from a high forehead, hands that moved with the precision of the instruments he repaired, and eyes that held a particular kind of sadness, the sort that comes from seeing too much time pass and too many people fail to appreciate the moments they were given. He wore a leather apron covered in oil stains and tiny scratches from wayward springs, and in his breast pocket, he always carried a single pocket watch, different from all the others in his shop, one that he never wound, never opened, and never spoke about to anyone who came through his door seeking repairs or purchases. The village itself was a place where time seemed to move differently than in the bustling cities beyond the hills, where horse-drawn carts still delivered milk in the early morning hours, where children played in streets that had worn smooth over centuries of footsteps, and where everyone knew everyone else's name, their family histories, their joys and sorrows, as if the entire community were one large family bound together by proximity and shared experience. The market square where Edmund's shop stood was the heart of this village, surrounded by the bakery that filled the air with the scent of fresh bread each dawn, the general store with its wooden barrels of flour and sugar, the blacksmith's forge that rang with the sound of hammer on anvil, and the small library housed in what had once been a manor house, its shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and wisdom. On the far side of the square stood an old fountain, no longer functional, its stone basin dry except when rain collected in its cracks, and children often sat on its edge eating apples or telling stories while their parents conducted business in the surrounding shops. It was to this fountain that Edmund would sometimes come in the evenings, sitting alone after closing his shop, watching the last light fade from the sky, and listening to the sounds of the village settling into night, the closing of shutters, the calling of mothers to their children, the final conversations between neighbors before doors were latched and candles were lit behind drawn curtains. He found something peaceful in these moments, a reminder that despite all the clocks in his shop, despite all the mechanisms designed to measure and mark and control time, life itself moved to a rhythm that could not be captured in gears and springs, a rhythm that was both more chaotic and more beautiful than anything human hands could construct. The story of Edmund's sadness, and the secret he carried in the unwound pocket watch against his heart, began many years earlier, when he was a young man of 25, newly married to a woman named Catherine who had the most remarkable laugh, a sound like bells chiming in unexpected harmony, and who had loved him with a fierceness that both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. Catherine had been the daughter of the village doctor, a woman educated beyond what was common for her time, who could read Latin and discuss philosophy, who painted watercolors of the surrounding countryside with such skill that people would stop to admire them in the shop window where Edmund displayed them with pride. They had met at the spring festival, where Edmund had been demonstrating a clock he had built that could play a simple melody when its hands reached certain hours, and Catherine had stood watching him for nearly an hour, fascinated not by the mechanism itself, but by the way his hands moved as he explained its workings, the passion in his voice when he spoke about the relationship between time and music, between measurement and beauty. Their courtship had been brief but intense, walks through the forest where they spoke about everything and nothing, evenings in his workshop where she would sit reading while he worked, the silence between them as comfortable as conversation, and within 6 months they were married in a simple ceremony attended by the entire village, a celebration that lasted from noon until the stars emerged, with dancing and food and toasts that grew more elaborate and ridiculous as the evening wore on. For 3 years they lived in the apartment above the clock shop, 3 years that Edmund would later remember as the happiest of his life, years filled with small moments of joy, morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, afternoon walks when the shop was quiet, evenings spent planning for the future they would build together, talking about the children they would have, the places they might travel, the clocks he would build and the paintings she would create. But time, as Edmund knew better than anyone, is both the most precious and the most cruel thing in existence, and in the spring of their 4th year together, Catherine fell ill with a fever that began as nothing more than a slight cough, a minor complaint that neither of them took seriously until it was far too late. Her father, the doctor, tried everything he knew, every remedy and treatment available to medical science of that era, but the fever only grew worse, burning through her body like fire through dry wood, and within 2 weeks she was bedridden, too weak to stand, her skin pale as moonlight, her beautiful eyes clouded with suffering. Edmund stayed by her side every moment he could, leaving the shop closed, holding her hand, reading to her from her favorite books, describing the spring flowers that were blooming in the window boxes outside their bedroom, trying desperately to keep her connected to the world she was slipping away from with each labored breath. On the 13th night of her illness, when the fever was at its worst and she drifted in and out of consciousness, Catherine had opened her eyes and looked at Edmund with a clarity that seemed impossible given her condition, and she had whispered something that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, a request so strange and specific that he initially thought it must be the fever talking, a delusion brought on by the heat consuming her from within. She had asked him to make her a clock, a special clock, one that would never move, never tick, never mark the passage of time, a clock that would capture and hold a single perfect moment forever, frozen and eternal, immune to the relentless forward march that was stealing her away from him. Edmund had promised, tears streaming down his face, squeezing her hand gently, telling her yes, of course, he would make her such a clock. He would make her anything she wanted, and she had smiled then, that brilliant smile he had fallen in love with, and closed her eyes, and by morning she was gone, passed away in the hours before dawn, leaving Edmund alone in a world that suddenly seemed drained of all colour and meaning. The funeral was held on a grey afternoon, rain falling steadily as the entire village gathered to pay their respects to a woman who had been beloved by everyone who knew her, and Edmund stood at the graveside holding the hand of Catherine's father, both men silent in their grief, watching as the casket was lowered into the earth in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the village, where wildflowers grew between the headstones and birds sang in the surrounding trees, heedless of human sorrow. In the weeks that followed, Edmund became a ghost of himself, moving through the motions of living without truly being present, opening the shop because that's what one did, repairing clocks because that was his trade, but finding no joy or satisfaction in work that had once been his passion, eating only because his body required it, sleeping fitfully when exhaustion finally overcame the ache in his chest that never seemed to diminish. His friends and neighbors tried to help, bringing food he didn't eat, offering company he didn't want, suggesting with increasing concern that he needed to move forward, to continue living, that Catherine would have wanted him to find happiness again, all the well-meaning phrases that people say when confronted with grief they cannot comprehend or fix. But Edmund could not move forward because he had made a promise, and despite his overwhelming sadness, despite the temptation to simply close the shop and disappear into his sorrow, he found himself driven by the need to fulfill Catherine's final request, to create the impossible clock she had asked for in her last moments of clarity, a timepiece that would capture a single moment and hold it forever against the inevitable decay of all things. For months, Edmund worked on the clock, spending every evening after closing the shop in his workshop on the 3rd floor, a space filled with tools and parts and half-finished projects, illuminated by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls lined with diagrams and sketches. He began with the basic mechanism, not a standard clock movement but something entirely new, something he had to invent from scratch, using principles of horology that he pushed to their absolute limits and beyond. The challenge was philosophical as much as mechanical. How does one build a device to measure time that does not itself move through time? How can something exist in the world of change and yet remain unchanged? A paradox that would have defeated most craftsmen before they even began. But Edmund was driven by love and grief in equal measure, twin engines that pushed him forward through failure after failure, through designs that seemed promising until he actually built them and discovered the fatal flaws, through sleepless nights where he would sit at his workbench with his head in his hands, wondering if he was simply going mad, if he was pursuing an impossible dream because facing reality was too painful to bear. Villagers noticed the change in him, the light burning late in the 3rd floor window every night, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands shook sometimes when he worked on customer repairs during the day, and they worried, discussing in whispered conversations whether someone should intervene, whether Edmund was destroying himself in pursuit of something that could never be achieved. But no one quite knew what to say or do, and so they simply watched and waited and hoped that time itself would heal him. Not understanding that time was the very thing he was at war with. The breakthrough came on a winter night, nearly a year after Catherine's death, when Edmund was sitting at his workbench staring at yet another failed prototype, a beautiful piece of work that nonetheless ticked steadily forward like every other clock ever made, and he suddenly understood what Catherine had actually been asking for. Not literally a clock that didn't move, but something far more profound, a way to step outside of time, to create a space where a moment could exist perpetually. Not frozen, but somehow liberated from the sequence of cause and effect that governed ordinary existence. He realized that the problem was not mechanical but conceptual. He had been thinking of time as a river flowing in one direction, and trying to build a dam to stop it, when what he actually needed was to build a pool beside the river, a place where water could rest without being part of the current, connected to the flow but not swept along by it. This insight led him in a completely new direction, and he began working with an energy that bordered on obsession, barely eating or sleeping, his fingers moving with mechanical precision as he assembled components of breathtaking delicacy, gears so small they could barely be seen with the naked eye, springs calibrated with such exactness that they responded to differences in tension that most craftsmen would have dismissed as irrelevant. The design that emerged was unlike anything that had ever existed in the history of clockmaking, a pocket watch, because Catherine's request had been intimate and personal, something to be held close, but a pocket watch of extraordinary complexity, with a case made of silver that he engraved with patterns that seemed to shift and flow when caught by the light, depicting not images but abstract representations of moments. Joy and sorrow and beauty and loss, all intertwined in an endless dance around the circumference. The face of the watch was made from a thin slice of moonstone, pale and luminous, and instead of numbers Edmund had carved symbols that had no specific meaning but seemed to suggest the passage of feelings rather than hours, markers for the stages of a heartbeat rather than the divisions of a day. The hands were made from blued steel. Elegant and simple, and he had designed them to move in a way that was almost imperceptible, not the steady tick-tick-tick of an ordinary clock but something more like the way memory moves, lurching forward and then pausing, revisiting, returning, a spiral rather than a line. But the true genius of the clock lay in its mechanism, hidden behind that moonstone face, a series of gears and springs arranged in a pattern that Edmund had calculated with mathematical precision, designed to reach a perfect equilibrium, a point where all the forces acting on each component were balanced so exactly that the watch would run forever without winding, drawing energy from the infinitesimal temperature variations in the air around it, powered by the ambient chaos of the universe itself, requiring nothing but existence to continue existing. More than that, the mechanism included a component that Edmund had invented entirely on his own, a regulator that could be adjusted to slow the movement of the hands to any speed desired, all the way down to perfect stillness, a clock that could tick normally or could be made to tick so slowly that a single second might take a year to pass, and at its slowest setting, the hands would appear completely motionless to any observer, marking time so gradually that no human lifetime would be sufficient to see them move, a clock that existed in time, but operated on a scale so vast that from any human perspective it might as well be eternal. When the clock was finally completed, on a spring morning 1 year to the day after Catherine's death, Edmund sat at his workbench holding the finished piece in his hands, feeling its subtle warmth from the friction of its internal mechanisms, hearing the almost inaudible whisper of its movement, and he wept, tears falling onto the silver case, not from sadness anymore but from something more complex, a mixture of achievement and loss, pride and emptiness. The satisfaction of having fulfilled an impossible promise, combined with the knowledge that Catherine would never see what he had created for her, that the only person who would have truly understood what this clock represented was gone, beyond the reach of any mechanism, beyond the influence of any art or science. He carried the watch to the cemetery that afternoon, walking slowly through streets that were bursting with spring life, trees in bloom, children playing, the world demonstrating its indifference to individual sorrow by continuing to be beautiful and vital and full of movement. At Catherine's grave, he knelt on the soft grass and spoke to her, telling her about the clock, explaining how it worked, describing the moment he had chosen to capture inside it. Not her death or even her illness, but a perfect autumn afternoon 2 years into their marriage when they had walked together through the forest and stopped at a clearing where sunlight streamed through red and gold leaves, and she had turned to him with that magnificent smile and said nothing, just stood there glowing with happiness. Existing fully in that moment, with no thought of past or future, pure presence, pure joy, and that was the moment he had encoded into the mechanism of the watch, setting the hands to mark that specific time, that particular quality of light and feeling, and then adjusting the regulator to its slowest possible setting, making that moment last effectively forever, a second stretched across eternity. Edmund had intended to leave the watch there on her grave, to bury it or somehow leave it as a permanent memorial, but as he knelt there preparing to say goodbye to it, he found he couldn't do it, couldn't leave this final piece of her behind, and so instead he placed it in his breast pocket where it had remained ever since, never removed, never wound because it needed no winding, never opened because seeing the hands frozen in that eternal moment would be too painful to bear. just carried next to his heart, a weight both physical and metaphorical, a reminder of love and loss and the strange relationship humans have with time, the way we try to hold on to moments even as we know intellectually that everything flows and changes and nothing can be kept forever except in memory, and even memory is unreliable, shifting and fading like old photographs left in sunlight. The creation of the impossible clock changed Edmund in ways he had not anticipated, and in the years that followed, he found himself gradually returning to life, not the same person he had been before Catherine's death. That man was gone as surely as she was, but someone new, someone who understood things about time and existence that most people never contemplate in their rush from birth to death. He reopened the shop fully, began taking pride in his work again, interacting with customers with a patience and wisdom that made people seek him out not just for clock repairs, but for advice, for perspective, for the calm presence he provided in a world that often seemed too loud and too fast. He became known throughout the village and the surrounding region as a master craftsman, and people would travel for days to bring him their most challenging repairs, timepieces that other clockmakers had declared unfixable, and Edmund would study these broken clocks with the same intensity he had brought to Catherine's impossible watch, seeing in each damaged mechanism a story of entropy and decay, a small battle in the war against time that we all wage and all eventually lose. But rather than finding this depressing, Edmund found meaning in it, because a clock that is broken but can be repaired is proof that endings are not always final, that things can be restored, that with enough skill and care and attention, functionality can be rescued from chaos, order can be reimposed on disorder, and while this resurrection is always temporary, while every repair is just postponing an inevitable final breakdown, there is nobility in the postponement. Grace in the act of preservation, value in the continued ticking, even when we know the ticking must someday stop. He began to see his work as a metaphor for how we should live, not denying death or pretending that time doesn't ravage all things, but rather embracing the temporary nature of existence and finding beauty in that temporariness, living fully in each moment because moments are all we have. They are the building blocks of life, and their value comes precisely from their fleeting nature. A sunset is beautiful partly because it doesn't last. A laugh is precious partly because it fades into silence. Love is powerful partly because we know it exists in time and time always ends. Over the years, Edmund trained several apprentices, young people who came to him wanting to learn the clockmaker's trade, and he taught them not just the technical skills of working with gears and springs and escapements, but also his philosophy of time. His understanding that their work was about more than just creating accurate timekeeping devices. It was about helping people navigate their relationship with mortality, giving them tools to organize their days, to meet obligations, to coordinate their lives with others, but also in a subtle way, reminding them constantly that time is passing, that this moment is unique and will never come again, that the hands moving around the clock face are marking something precious and irreplaceable. Some of his apprentices understood this deeper dimension and became not just competent craftsmen but artists in their own right, creating clocks that were beautiful objects as well as functional tools, timepieces that made people pause and think when they looked at them, that added something meaningful to the spaces they occupied. Others learned the technical skills but never quite grasped the philosophy, and they went on to have successful careers as ordinary clockmakers, and Edmund was proud of them too, because even practical work done well has dignity and value, and the world needs reliable clocks even if those clocks carry no deeper meaning beyond their function. As Edmund aged, his hair going from silver to pure white, his hands developing the slight tremor that comes to even the steadiest craftsmen in their later years, he found himself thinking more and more about legacy, about what would remain after he was gone, what marks he had made on the world, what meaning his life had held. The shop would continue. He had arranged for his best apprentice, a young woman named Helena with extraordinary talent and infinite patience, to take it over when he retired or died, whichever came first, and he knew she would maintain the standards he had established, would care for the collection of clocks, would serve the community with the same dedication he had shown. But beyond the physical shop and its contents, Edmund wondered what of his real work would persist. The impossible clock he had built for Catherine was his masterpiece, the culmination of everything he understood about his craft, but it was also entirely private, something no one else had seen or would see, a secret achievement that would die with him unless he chose to share it. For a long time, he resisted the urge to reveal the clock's existence, feeling that it was too personal, that explaining it would diminish it somehow, would turn a profound expression of love into a curiosity for people to marvel at and then forget. But gradually, as his 70th birthday approached and he felt the weight of years in his bones, he began to reconsider, to think that perhaps the clock's story had value beyond his personal experience, that maybe there were others who struggled with loss and time and mortality, who might find something meaningful in knowing that someone had once tried to build a cage for moments, and had succeeded, at least in a way. It was with this thought in mind that Edmund decided to write down the story, not as a technical document describing the clock's mechanism, though he included some of that detail, but as a narrative, a meditation on love and time, and the human need to hold onto what we cannot keep. He worked on the manuscript in the evenings, sitting at a small desk in the corner of his bedroom, filling page after page with his careful handwriting, describing his life with Catherine, the pain of losing her, the obsession that had driven him to create the impossible clock, the philosophical journey he had undertaken in trying to solve the paradox she had set before him, and finally the peace he had found not in defeating time, but in understanding his relationship to it. Accepting that all things pass and finding in that acceptance, not despair, but a kind of quiet joy, a liberation that comes from releasing the need to control what cannot be controlled. The manuscript grew longer than he had initially intended, becoming not just the story of a clock but a kind of autobiography, a record of a life spent in intimate conversation with time, and when he finally finished it, he read through the entire thing in one sitting, making small corrections, adjusting phrases, and ultimately deciding that it was as complete as it was ever going to be, an honest accounting of his journey, flawed and imperfect like all human endeavors, but true in the ways that mattered most. Edmund sealed the manuscript in an envelope and gave it to Helena along with specific instructions. It was to be kept in the shop safe and not opened until after his death, and then she was free to do with it whatever she thought appropriate, publish it if she believed others might find value in it, or simply keep it as a private record, or even destroy it if she felt that was best. He trusted her judgment completely, and that trust was perhaps his final gift to her, the recognition that the shop and its legacy were now hers to steward as she saw fit. That his time of control had passed, and it was now her turn to decide what clockmaking meant, and what role it would play in the ongoing life of the village. With the manuscript complete and delivered, Edmund felt a sense of completion that surprised him with its intensity, as if he had been carrying a burden he hadn't fully recognized until it was set down, and the remaining days of his life, which turned out to be fewer than he expected, took on a quality of grace and ease that he had not experienced in decades. He continued working in the shop, but at a more relaxed pace, spending more time talking with customers, sharing stories about clocks he had repaired over the years, the strange places timepieces ended up, the sentimental attachments people formed to devices that were ultimately just assemblages of metal and glass and wood, but which carried memories and associations that gave them value far beyond their material worth. On an autumn evening, 50 years almost to the day after Catherine's death, Edmund was sitting at his workbench repairing a small mantel clock that had belonged to a customer's grandmother when he felt a sudden tightness in his chest, a sensation like a spring winding too tight, and he set down his tools carefully, with the instinct of a craftsman who takes care of his instruments even in crisis, and he knew with absolute certainty that his time had come. That the mechanism of his own body was finally winding down past the point where any repair was possible. He felt no fear, only a kind of curiosity about what came next, whether there was anything beyond this life or whether consciousness simply ended like a candle blown out, and in his final moments, sitting in the workshop surrounded by the ticking of 100 clocks all marking time in their own rhythms, he reached into his breast pocket and drew out Catherine's watch, the impossible clock he had carried next to his heart for 5 decades, and he held it in his palm, feeling its subtle warmth. Sensing the nearly imperceptible vibration of its eternal mechanism, and he smiled, thinking about that autumn afternoon in the forest, that perfect moment he had captured in silver and moonstone and precision gears, a moment that was still happening somewhere inside the watch, still unfolding at a pace so slow that it would take eons to complete, and he found that thought comforting, the idea that something of Catherine, some echo of their love, would continue existing in the world long after he was gone. Ticking away in its own private time stream, independent of history and human affairs, a secret preserved in metal and mathematics. Edmund died sitting in his chair, the watch still clutched in his hand, and he was found there the next morning by Helena, who recognized immediately what had happened and who sat with him for a long while before calling anyone, keeping vigil the way one might stand watch over something precious and fragile, honoring the passage of a person who had been not just her teacher, but her mentor and friend and the closest thing to family she had known. The funeral was attended by nearly everyone in the village, a testament to the quiet impact Edmund had made through decades of patient work and kind presence, and people shared stories about clocks he had repaired, conversations they had had with him, the way he had always seemed to have time for anyone who needed it despite the demanding nature of his work, and through all these remembrances, a picture emerged of a man who had transformed personal tragedy into a kind of gentle wisdom, who had learned to hold loss and beauty in the same hand without diminishing either one. Helena buried him in the cemetery beside Catherine, and on his gravestone she had carved a simple epitaph: "He measured time but was not measured by it. words that she felt captured something essential about who Edmund had been and what his life had meant. After the funeral, Helena opened the safe in the shop and retrieved the manuscript Edmund had left for her, and she spent an entire weekend reading it. Sitting in the apartment above the shop where Edmund had lived his entire adult life, surrounded by the constant ticking of clocks, and as she read, she found herself crying and laughing in turns, moved by the love story, fascinated by the technical descriptions of the impossible clock's creation, and ultimately inspired by Edmund's philosophical journey, his gradual acceptance of time's nature and his own mortality. She recognized that the manuscript was something special, not just a personal document but a work that deserved to be shared, that might bring comfort or insight to others who struggled with the same questions Edmund had grappled with, and so she began the process of preparing it for publication, typing up Edmund's handwritten pages, adding footnotes where technical terms needed explanation, writing a brief introduction that provided context about Edmund's life and work. The manuscript was published 6 months later as a small book titled The Clockmaker's Secret, and while it never became a bestseller or received significant attention from critics, it found its audience slowly and organically, passed from hand to hand, recommended by readers to friends who were going through difficult times, used by grief counselors who found in Edmund's story a powerful illustration of how loss can be transformed not into forgetting, but into a different kind of presence. A carrying forward that honors what was lost, while still allowing space for continued life and even joy. Helena ran the clock shop for the next 30 years, maintaining Edmund's standards and continuing his tradition of combining technical excellence with philosophical depth, and she trained her own apprentices in the same way Edmund had trained her, passing on not just skills, but also a way of thinking about time and mortality and the human condition. Shop became something of a landmark, mentioned in regional guidebooks as a place worth visiting, known for the quality of its work, but also for the slightly mystical reputation it had acquired, a sense that something deeper happened there than just the repair of mechanical devices, that customers left not just with fixed clocks but with shifted perspectives, small adjustments to how they thought about their lives and their relationship to the ever-flowing river of moments that we all travel upon from birth to death. And in this way, Edmund's influence extended far beyond his own lifetime, touching people he would never meet, helping them navigate the same questions he had wrestled with, offering through his story and his philosophical legacy a kind of map for the territory of grief and acceptance and the strange beauty of existence in time. As for the impossible clock itself, Helena decided to honor what she understood to be Edmund's wishes and kept it safe but private, not displaying it or showing it to anyone, preserving it as Edmund had preserved it, a secret held close. She stored it in a special case in the shop's safe, cushioned in velvet, and once a year on the anniversary of Catherine's death, she would take it out and hold it for a moment, feeling its warmth and its subtle vibration, thinking about the love that had created it and the grief that had shaped it and the wisdom that had come from both, and then she would return it to its resting place where it continued its nearly imperceptible journey through time, the hands moving so slowly that no eye could detect their motion. Marking an afternoon in a forest that happened decades ago, but which inside the watch's private universe was still happening, always happening, forever happening, a moment captured and held against the tide of entropy, a small victory of love over time's relentless forward march, proof that while we cannot stop time or defeat death, we can create pockets of meaning and beauty and remembrance that persist, that carry forward the best of what we were and what we felt and what we valued. Echoes that continue sounding long after the original voice has fallen silent. Years passed in the village, generations turning over as they always do, children becoming parents, becoming grandparents, the cycle of life continuing its eternal rotation, and the clock shop remained, a constant presence in the changing landscape, and Edmund's story remained too, told and retold, sometimes accurately and sometimes with embellishments and elaborations that transformed it from history into legend, and this transformation seemed appropriate somehow, seemed fitting. Because the truest things often live most powerfully not as facts but as stories, as narratives that capture something essential about human experience, even as they drift away from literal accuracy. The impossible clock became something of a myth, a local legend about a clockmaker who had loved so deeply that he managed to build a machine that defied the laws of physics. A tale that perhaps was not entirely true in every detail, but which was true in the way that mattered most, true to the spirit of what Edmund had accomplished and what his life had meant, and that truth lived on in the village, influencing how people thought about time and love and loss. Adding to the collective wisdom that communities accumulate and pass down, the accumulated understanding of what it means to be human, to live in time, to love and lose and continue living despite loss, to find meaning not in permanence but in the beauty of temporary things, in moments that cannot be held except in memory, in experiences that shape us even as they slip into the past. And so the story comes full circle, back to the shop on the corner of the village square, where clocks still tick in their hundreds, where craftsmen and craftswomen still bend over their workbenches making repairs and building new timepieces, where people still come seeking not just the fixing of broken mechanisms, but also perhaps some less tangible thing, some insight or comfort or perspective that comes from being in a place where time is taken seriously. Where the passage of moments is not ignored or rushed through, but acknowledged and honored and understood as the precious thing it is, because we are all travelers through time, all passengers on a journey with a beginning and an end, and how we navigate that journey, how we attend to the moments we are given, how we hold what we love even as we acknowledge we cannot keep it forever. These are the questions that define a life and Edmund's story. The story of a clockmaker who loved and lost and built something impossible and found wisdom in the process is ultimately a story about all of us, about the universal human experience of being alive in time, of trying to hold on to what cannot be held, of learning to let go without forgetting, of finding in acceptance not resignation but a kind of peace, a quiet joy that comes from understanding our place in the great flowing river of existence. Knowing that we are part of something larger than ourselves. Something that continues, something that moves forward carrying everything we were, and everything we loved into a future we will never see but which we help create through how we live our moments. Through the small acts of love and creation and care that ripple outward in ways we can never fully comprehend, touching lives we will never know about, making differences we can never measure, leaving marks that may fade but which matter nonetheless, because everything matters, every moment matters. Every act of attention and care and love matters, not because it will last forever but precisely because it will not, because it exists briefly in the vast expanse of time and then is gone, and in that briefness, in that impermanence, in that fragile temporary existence, there is beauty beyond measure, meaning beyond words, and a kind of immortality after all, not the immortality of things that never change but the immortality of influence, of stories told and retold, of wisdom passed down. Of love that shapes not just those who feel it but those who hear about it, generations into the future, rippling outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water, spreading until they reach shores we cannot see, carrying forward through time the best of what we were, the most true parts of our existence, the moments when we were most fully alive and most completely ourselves. And in this way, through story and memory and influence, we do achieve a kind of victory over time. Not by stopping it or escaping it, but by working with it, by creating within its flow patterns and meanings and beauties that persist, that matter, that make the brief journey from birth to death not just bearable but magnificent, not just endurable but wonderful, filled with opportunities for joy and connection and creation, for making things that matter even if they don't last forever, for loving even though love makes us vulnerable to loss. For building and creating and caring even though everything eventually breaks down, because the alternative is to live defensively, protectively, holding ourselves back from experience to avoid pain, and that is not living at all, that is merely existing, waiting for an end that comes anyway regardless of whether we truly lived or merely marked time. And Edmund's great achievement was not just the impossible clock, though that was remarkable, but rather his journey from trying to control time to understanding it, from fighting against loss to accepting it, from seeing impermanence as tragedy to seeing it as the condition that makes everything meaningful, the framework within which all beauty and love and significance exists, and this understanding, hard-won through suffering and sustained by love, is his true legacy, the secret that the clockmaker discovered and shared. Not through the mechanism of an impossible watch, but through the example of a life lived with attention and care and dedication, a life that honored time by using it well, by spending it on things that mattered, by creating beauty and helping others and maintaining standards of excellence and passing on knowledge and caring, deeply about craft and quality and relationships and all the small details that make up a well-lived life, and in the end, sitting in his workshop surrounded by ticking clocks. Holding in his hand the proof that love can transcend time even if it cannot defeat it, Edmund found peace, not the peace of having solved all problems or answered all questions, but the deeper peace that comes from accepting that some questions have no answers, that some losses cannot be repaired, that life is fundamentally about living within uncertainty and impermanence and finding ways to create meaning and beauty despite, or perhaps because of, those constraints. The village continued its rhythms long after Edmund's story became legend, and the clock shop continued its work, and new clockmakers came and trained and eventually took over, each one adding something of their own to the tradition while maintaining the core principles that Edmund had established. And in this way, institutions persist even as individuals pass, knowledge is preserved even as those who discovered it return to the earth, and the great project of human civilization continues. This accumulation of understanding and skill and wisdom, passed from generation to generation like a flame carried through darkness, never burning forever in any single lamp, but always transferring to new wicks, new fuel, continuing forward through time as long as there are hands to carry it, and minds to value it. The impossible clock remained in its case in the safe, seen by fewer and fewer people as years passed, until eventually it was known only through stories, its existence as much legend as fact, and perhaps that was appropriate. Perhaps objects of such intimate personal meaning are better preserved as myths than as museum pieces, better honored through story than through display, because a story can be adapted and reinterpreted by each hearer, can speak to their specific circumstances and needs. While a physical object can only be what it is, frozen and complete, admirable but not transformable, whereas stories are living things that change as they are told, that grow and evolve and maintain relevance across changing times and circumstances. In the decades following Edmund's death, the world beyond the village changed dramatically, as worlds always do. Technologies emerged that would have seemed like magic to the clockmaker, devices that measured time with atomic precision, electronic displays that showed hours and minutes without any moving gears at all. Eventually, even the abandonment of physical timepieces altogether, as people began carrying devices in their pockets that did 1,000 things, including telling time with accuracy, that would have astounded any craftsman from Edmund's era. The art of mechanical clockmaking became increasingly rare, a specialty pursued by fewer and fewer people, valued more for its aesthetic and historical significance than for its practical utility, because in a world where every person carried a device that synchronized with global time standards and never needed winding or regulation, the idea of a mechanical clock that required regular maintenance and was only approximately accurate seemed quaint, charming. A connection to a slower and simpler past that many people romanticized, even as they would never actually want to return to it. The village itself changed too, slowly at first and then with gathering speed. Roads were paved, electricity came, then telephone lines, then internet cables, connecting the small community to the vast network of global communication and commerce. And young people increasingly left for opportunities in cities, and tourism grew as urban dwellers sought out picturesque rural locations where they could pretend for a weekend that they lived simpler lives. And the character of the place shifted from a self-contained community where everyone knew everyone else to something more diffuse, more connected to the outside world, more diverse in its population, but perhaps less cohesive in its identity. The clock shop adapted to these changes, as all things must adapt or die, and by the time Helena's successor took over, a man named Marcus who had trained in the city before seeking out the village specifically because of Edmund's reputation and the shop's storied history, the business had shifted to focus primarily on antique restoration and custom pieces for collectors, people who valued mechanical timepieces not for their utility but for their artistry, their connection to tradition. Their representation of a kind of craftsmanship that seemed endangered in an age of mass production and digital precision. Marcus had read Edmund's manuscript, had been moved by it in ways that directly influenced his decision to abandon a promising career in engineering to pursue the dying art of clockmaking, and he approached his work with a reverence that came from understanding the philosophical dimensions of the craft, seeing each repair not just as fixing a broken machine, but as preserving a piece of history, maintaining a connection to the past. Honoring the hands that had built these devices and the lives they had measured. He began offering workshops and classes, teaching anyone interested the basics of clock repair and maintenance, not necessarily to create new professional clockmakers, but to share knowledge that might otherwise be lost, to give people an appreciation for the complexity and ingenuity involved in pre-electronic timekeeping, and these classes became surprisingly popular. Filled with a mix of retirees looking for engaging hobbies and younger people who were part of a growing movement that valued traditional skills, handcraft, the ability to repair and maintain objects rather than simply discarding and replacing them. Through these classes and through his restoration work, Marcus found himself frequently telling Edmund's story, or at least the public version of it, the tale of a clockmaker who had loved deeply and suffered greatly and created something remarkable in response to loss. And he noticed that people responded to the story in different ways depending on where they were in their own lives. Those who were young and had not yet experienced significant loss found it romantic and tragic. Those who were older and had known grief recognized something true in it, saw reflected in Edmund's journey their own struggles with time and mortality and the difficulty of letting go. And those who were in the midst of acute grief sometimes found in the story a kind of permission to feel deeply, to honor their pain by attending to it rather than rushing through it. To understand that creating something meaningful from loss was possible even if it took time and effort and couldn't erase the fundamental reality of what had been lost. Marcus also noticed that the story seemed to function as a kind of filtering mechanism, attracting certain types of people to the shop, those who valued depth and meaning, who were looking for more than just a transaction, who wanted their objects to carry significance beyond mere function. And this created a community of sorts, customers who became friends, who would visit the shop not just when they needed something repaired but simply to talk. To be in a space where time was treated as something precious rather than something to be optimized and scheduled down to the minute, where conversation could meander and explore without needing to reach conclusions, where silence was comfortable and rushing was unnecessary. One day, perhaps 20 years after Marcus had taken over the shop, an old woman came in carrying a small wooden box, worn and battered, and she asked to speak with the owner about something delicate and important. And when Marcus came to the front counter, she introduced herself as Catherine's sister's daughter, Edmund's niece by marriage, and she explained that she had something that had been passed down through her family with instructions that it should eventually return to the clock shop. But only when the time felt right, and after carrying it for decades and feeling increasingly that her own death was approaching, she had decided that now was that time. She opened the box, and inside, wrapped in cloth that might once have been white but had yellowed with age, was a small journal bound in leather, pages filled with Catherine's handwriting, and the old woman explained that this was a diary Catherine had kept during her illness, written during the moments when she was lucid enough to hold a pen, and in it she had recorded her thoughts about dying, about time, about what she wanted Edmund to understand. Including an explanation of why she had asked him to build the impossible clock, what she had actually meant by that strange request, and the woman said she had never read it herself, had kept it sealed as her mother had instructed, but felt that Marcus, as the current keeper of Edmund's legacy, should have it, should decide whether its contents should be revealed or whether it should remain private, added to the collection of secrets that the shop held. Marcus accepted the journal with trembling hands, understanding immediately the significance of what he held, and he thanked the woman profusely. And after she left, he sat alone in the shop after closing, lights dimmed, surrounded by the familiar chorus of ticking, and he carefully opened the journal and began to read Catherine's words, written in a shaky hand that grew increasingly difficult to decipher as the entries progressed and her strength failed, but still legible, still coherent. Still carrying the force of a mind that remained sharp, even as the body that housed it was failing. The entries began mundane, complaints about the fever, descriptions of treatments, expressions of frustration at her weakness, but gradually they became more philosophical, more focused on the question of time and how we experience it, and Catherine wrote about how illness had changed her perception, how when you are healthy time seems endless, the future stretches out infinitely, you assume you will have time for everything you want to do, but when you are dying, time becomes visible in a new way. Becomes precious and terrible, each moment both more valuable and more painful because you can feel it slipping away, can sense the finite nature of your remaining days, and this awareness brings a clarity that is both gift and curse, makes you see what truly matters, but also makes you aware of how much time you wasted on things that didn't matter, how many moments you failed to fully inhabit because you were distracted or worried or simply taking for granted that there would always be more moments. More time, more chances. Catherine wrote about her regrets. Not big dramatic failures, but small losses, days she had been irritable when she might have been kind, evenings she had spent worrying about trivial things instead of appreciating Edmund's presence, moments of beauty she had walked past without stopping, and she wrote about how desperately she wished she could go back, not to change major life decisions, but just to pay more attention, to be more present, to drink more deeply from the well of experience while she had the chance. And this led her to think about the nature of time itself, how strange it is that we move through it in only one direction, always forward, never able to return, never able to pause and rest in a moment we want to preserve, and she wrote about how unfair this seemed, how cruel that consciousness should be structured in a way that makes us perpetual exiles from our own past, able to remember but never to return, able to wish but never to recapture. And it was from these reflections that the idea of the impossible clock had emerged, not as a technical challenge but as a philosophical wish, a desire to somehow step outside the river of time, to create a space where a moment could simply exist without leading to the next moment, without being part of the relentless sequence of cause and effect, a refuge from the tyranny of forward motion, a place where being could take precedence over becoming, where existence could rest rather than always rushing toward non-existence. She wrote that she didn't actually expect Edmund to build such a clock, that she knew it was probably impossible, but she wanted to give him something to focus on during his grief, a task that would require all his skill and intelligence, something that would keep him connected to his craft and prevent him from sinking entirely into sorrow. And more than that, she wanted to give him a way to think about their love that didn't focus solely on the loss. A framework for understanding that what they had shared was so valuable precisely because it existed in time, because it had a beginning and would have an ending, because it was temporary and therefore infinitely precious. And if he could build a clock that held a moment forever, then he would have proof that some things in some way do persist, that the right combination of love and skill and determination can create something that transcends the ordinary limits of existence. Not by denying those limits, but by working within them so skillfully that they are transformed from prison walls into the very structure that gives meaning to what is contained within them. Catherine's final entry, written in a hand so shaky that Marcus could barely read it, said simply that she hoped Edmund would understand that the impossible clock was not about stopping time or denying death, but about learning to hold moments without grasping them so tightly that they crumbled, about learning to love without attachment, about learning to let go without forgetting, about finding in impermanence not tragedy but the very ground of meaning. And she wrote that she loved him, would always love him. And that love would continue existing somehow even after she was gone, not as a ghost or spirit but as an influence, a shaping force that had changed him and would continue to inform his actions and choices for as long as he lived, making him in some sense a carrier of her presence, a vessel through which what she had been continued to act upon the world. And in this way, death was not complete erasure but transformation, not ending but changing form. Not loss but transition into a different kind of existence. Marcus closed the journal and sat in silence for a long time, watching the light fade from the windows, listening to the clocks tick their overlapping rhythms, and he felt the weight of this revelation, the understanding that Edmund had known, had perhaps always known, that Catherine's request was not really about building a clock but about building a way to survive her loss, a framework for grieving that would lead eventually to acceptance and peace, and Edmund had succeeded. Had built the clock, and in building it had built also a way forward, a way to live with loss that honored both the reality of what was gone and the necessity of continuing to live. Marcus understood now why Edmund had never shown the clock to anyone, never sought recognition for his masterpiece, because it was not really a clock at all, or rather it was more than a clock. It was a physical manifestation of internal process, a spiritual exercise rendered in silver and gears, a prayer machine that Edmund had carried against his heart, not because it would bring Catherine back, but because it reminded him that love continues even when the beloved is gone. That moments can be held even when they cannot be repeated, that the past remains part of us even as we move forward into the future, not weighing us down but informing us, shaping us, giving depth and meaning to our present experience. Marcus decided that Catherine's journal should remain private, should be kept with the impossible clock in the safe, the two objects together forming a complete record of a love story that spanned life and death, time and timelessness, loss and acceptance, and he felt no need to publish the journal or share its revelations more widely, because some things are more powerful when they remain partially hidden, when they maintain an element of mystery. When each person who encounters their story can interpret it through their own experience and fill in the gaps with their own understanding. The shop continued its work, seasons turned, years passed, Marcus eventually trained his own successor, and the impossible clock remained in its safe, ticking so slowly that its movement was imperceptible, measuring time on a scale that made human lifespans seem like heartbeats, like individual frames in a film running so slowly that watching it would require geological patience. And this seemed right somehow, seemed fitting, a timepiece that existed in time but operated on time's deepest level. The level where change is so gradual that it appears as stillness, where motion is so slow that it feels like rest, where the distinction between being and becoming blurs into something that is both and neither, a paradox embodied in mechanism, a koan rendered in metal and crystal. And so the story continues, reaching forward toward us across the decades, carried by people who heard it and were changed by it, transmitted through the shop that bears Edmund's legacy even though his name appears nowhere on its sign, alive in the continued practice of clockmaking as a meditative art rather than merely a technical skill, present in the way certain people approach time, not as an enemy to be fought or a resource to be managed, but as the medium in which life unfolds. The canvas on which meaning is painted, the stage on which the drama of existence plays out, and understanding this. Understanding that time is not separate from life, but is life's very substance. The understanding that each moment is both infinitely valuable and utterly ordinary, that the secret to living well is not to seek extraordinary experiences, but to bring full attention to ordinary ones, to be present for the small beauties and small kindnesses and small joys that make up the texture of a day, to measure life not in grand achievements, but in moments of connection, of awareness, of genuine presence. And this understanding, which Edmund discovered through suffering and Catherine intuited through her illness, is the real treasure that the clock shop preserves, not the impossible clock itself, which is merely an object however remarkable, but the wisdom that its creation represented, the hard-won knowledge that love is stronger than death not because it prevents death, but because it continues after death, shaping those who remain, influencing their actions. Living on through memory and through the changes that love worked in the beloved, making us different people than we would have been without it, and those differences persist, ripple outward, affect others, and in this way nothing is truly lost. Everything that ever happens leaves traces that extend into the future in patterns too complex to track but real nonetheless, meaningful nonetheless. The village at twilight, seen from the hill where the cemetery rests, looks much as it might have looked in Edmund's time, the same basic geography, the same quality of light as the sun settles behind the western hills, casting long shadows that stretch across the valley, And if you listen carefully, standing there among the grave where Edmund and Catherine rest side by side beneath stones that have weathered and softened over the decades, you might fancy that you can hear it, a very faint ticking. So quiet that it might be imagination, so subtle that it might be the sound of your own heartbeat mistaken for something external. A rhythm that marks time so slowly that a human lifetime is just one tick, one small movement forward on a journey that will take eons to complete, the sound of the impossible clock continuing its work, holding its moment, proving that some things, if built with enough love and skill and understanding, can approach permanence, can last long enough that from any human perspective they might as well be eternal, and whether this sound is real or imagined doesn't matter. What matters is what it represents, the idea that something of Edmund and Catherine persists, that their story continues to unfold in its own way, that the moment they shared in the autumn forest is still happening somewhere, will always be happening, a second stretched across infinity, proof that while time cannot be stopped, it can be honored, can be treated with the respect it deserves as the medium of all experience, the container of all meaning, the river in which we live and move and have our being. Always flowing, always changing, always carrying us forward toward an end we cannot escape but need not fear, because the journey itself is the point, the moments themselves are the treasure, and learning to be present for those moments, to drink deeply from them, to allow them to shape us and change us and make us more fully ourselves, that is the art of living, that is what Edmund learned through loss and what Catherine understood through illness. That is what the impossible clock embodies, and what the shop preserves, and what the story passes forward to anyone wise enough to hear its deeper meaning, beneath the surface narrative of love and death and remarkable machines. Night falls completely now, stars emerging one by one overhead, and the village settles into sleep, doors locked, lamps extinguished, families gathered in their homes, the day's work done, the day's concerns released, and in the clock shop on the corner of the square, the night watchman among all those assembled timepieces sits in silence, the impossible clock in its safe, ticking so slowly that its next complete rotation will occur long after every person currently alive has returned to dust. Long after the village itself may have vanished or transformed beyond recognition, long after the languages we speak have evolved into forms we wouldn't understand, but still ticking, still measuring its particular moment, still holding in its mechanism the proof that human beings, fragile and temporary as we are, can create things that touch on permanence, that approach eternity, that carry forward through time some essence of who we were and what we valued and how we loved, and in this way, through craft and care and the patient work of hands guided by hearts that understood something true about existence, we build meaning from moments, we construct significance from the raw material of passing time, we make our lives matter not by lasting forever but by living fully, by paying attention, by loving deeply, by creating beautifully, by passing forward to future generations not just objects and stories, but ways of being, ways of seeing. Ways of understanding what it means to be human, mortal, alive in time, blessed and cursed with consciousness that knows its own ending, graced with the ability to love even though love makes us vulnerable to loss, gifted with the capacity to create meaning even though we know that meaning will die with us unless we find ways to embed it in things that last, in stories, in traditions, in shops and crafts and careful work, in the patient teaching of apprentices, in the slow accumulation of wisdom that is humanity's real inheritance, passed down through generations like a flame carried through darkness. And so Edmund's legacy continues. The clockmaker's secret keeps on being revealed to those who are ready to understand it. The impossible clock ticks its nearly imperceptible tick in its velvet-lined case, and time flows on, carrying everything forward, destroying and creating in the same motion, taking and giving with the same hand. The great mystery at the heart of existence, the fact that nothing lasts and yet somehow everything matters, that we are temporary and yet our actions have permanent consequences, that we die and yet something of us continues, transformed perhaps beyond recognition but real nonetheless, present in the world we helped shape, alive in the people we touched, embodied in the objects we created with love and skill and care, and this is the final truth, the deepest secret. The thing Edmund learned and Catherine knew, and the impossible clock proves. That consciousness in time, awareness of mortality, the certainty of ending, these are not curses but gifts, not limitations but the very conditions that make meaning possible. Because without time there is no change, without change there is no story, without story there is no meaning, without meaning there is no life worth living. And so we embrace time even as we mourn its passing, we accept loss even as we celebrate what we had, we let go even as we remember. We move forward even as we carry the past within us, and in this dance between holding and releasing, between remembering and forgetting, between the permanence we wish for and the impermanence we must accept, we find not resolution but grace, not answers but peace, not control but surrender, and in surrender we discover something unexpected. That letting go of control is not losing everything but gaining everything, that accepting impermanence is not admitting defeat but achieving victory, that dancing with time rather than fighting against it is not resignation but wisdom, and this wisdom, carried forward by those who learn it and pass it on, is the true impossible clock, the mechanism that transcends mechanism, the timepiece that measures something more than time. The secret that was never really secret because it has always been available to anyone willing to pay attention, to suffer consciously, to love completely, to live fully in the moments they are given, treating each one as both utterly ordinary and infinitely precious, which is what each moment is, what each moment has always been, what the clocks in Edmund's shop have been saying all along in their overlapping chorus of ticks, their constant reminder that time is passing. This moment is happening now and will never happen again, that attention must be paid, that presence is possible, that life is here now in this breath, this heartbeat, this tick of the clock, this turn of the earth, this moment that we can never hold but need never lose because by experiencing it fully we make it part of ourselves, woven into the fabric of our consciousness, carried forward into every future moment, informing and shaping who we become, and in this way nothing is ever truly lost. Everything remains, transformed but real, past but present, gone but here, and the impossible clock ticks on, marking time that is no time. Measuring moment that is all moments, holding in its precise mechanism the paradox at the heart of existence, the truth that cannot be spoken but only lived, the secret that must be discovered by each person individually, but which connects us all in our shared condition of being alive, being conscious, being temporary, being precious, being here now, always now, eternally now, in the only time that ever really exists, this present moment that contains all past and all future. This breath that is both first and last, this heartbeat that is both singular and eternal, this tick of the impossible clock that sounds once and forever, marking the passage of time while simultaneously stepping outside time, measuring while being unmeasured, changing while remaining unchanged, impossible and real, secret and obvious, Edmund's gift and Catherine's wish and life's truth and death's promise and time's nature, all contained in silver and moonstone, in gears and springs, in craft and love. In story and silence, ticking, always ticking, forever ticking, in the safe in the shop on the corner of the square in the village between the hills, carrying forward through darkness and light, through generations and centuries, through change and constancy, through loss and presence, through ending and continuation, the clockmaker's secret, which is no secret at all but simply this. Pay attention, be present, love deeply, work carefully. Honor time, accept impermanence, find peace not in having but in being, and in being fully, completely, consciously here in each moment. Discover that you have always been eternal, that the eternal is not somewhere else or sometime else, but here and now in this breath, this heartbeat, this tick, this moment, this life. This gift of time that we receive and spend and cannot keep but need never lose because having lived it. Having been present for it, having met it with full consciousness, we make it permanent in the only way that matters, by letting it change us, shape us, make us who we are, carriers of moments, vessels of experience, living bridges between past and future, always standing in the present that is both vanishing and arriving, both ending and beginning, both the last moment of what was and the first moment of what will be, and in that present, in that eternal now. The impossible clock ticks its infinitely slow tick, and Edmund rests beside Catherine, and their love continues in story and shop, and the hands of craftspeople who learned from those who learned from those who learned from him, and the wisdom flows forward through time like water through a river, taking different forms but remaining essentially itself. And this is how consciousness defeats death, not by refusing to die but by passing forward what was learned in living. Not by lasting forever as individuals, but by contributing to the great collective understanding that grows through generations. Not by stopping time, but by using time well, spending moments on things that matter, and what matters is simple and profound. To pay attention, to be kind, to do work that serves, to love deeply, to create beauty, to honor truth, to face mortality with courage, to embrace impermanence with grace, and to understand that in the end, there is no end, only transformation, only continuation in different forms. Only the eternal cycle of time that makes and breaks and makes again forever, and this is beautiful, this is enough, this is everything, and the impossible clock knows this, has always known this, will always know this. Ticking in its safe, keeping its secret, which is that there are no secrets, only truths waiting to be discovered by those ready to receive them. And the story continues, must continue, will continue as long as there are people to tell it and ears to hear it and hearts to understand it. The story of Edmund and Catherine, the clockmaker and his impossible clock, which is really the story of all of us, everyone who has ever loved and lost. Everyone who has ever tried to hold on to moments that slip away, everyone who has ever sought meaning in a world of change, everyone who has ever built something with their hands and heart, everyone who has ever learned wisdom through suffering, everyone who has ever discovered that the things that matter most cannot be kept but only carried, not possessed but only honored, not controlled but only celebrated, and in celebrating them, in honoring them, in carrying them forward. We discover that we are richer for having had them even though we have lost them, that grief is the price of love and love is worth the price, that nothing lasts and everything matters, that time is both enemy and friend, that impermanence is both curse and blessing, that consciousness is both burden and gift, and that life, this strange, temporary, painful, beautiful, impossible, perfect thing called life, is worth living fully, completely, consciously, gratefully, one moment at a time. Which is the only way it can be lived, the only way it has ever been lived, the only way it will ever be lived, moment following moment like ticks of a clock, each one unique, each one precious, each one a gift we receive and release, in the eternal rhythm of existence that the impossible clock measures in its own impossibly slow way, proving that love transcends time while remaining within it, that some things approach forever while remaining finite. That the temporary can touch the eternal, that mortality and immortality are not opposites but partners in the dance of existence, and this dance goes on, will always go on, carried forward by those who understand its steps, passed down by those who have learned its rhythm, embodied in shops and stories and careful work, in clocks and craft and conscious living, in the patient attention to moments that makes moments eternal. In the full presence that makes each instant both complete in itself and part of something larger, in the wisdom that knows when to hold and when to release, when to grasp and when to let go, when to work and when to rest, when to speak and when to be silent, and the impossible clock ticking its infinitely patient tick, marking time at the edge of timelessness, measuring moments that last forever. Holds in its mechanism the proof that Edmund sought and Catherine requested, and life offers to all who are willing to see it. That everything ends and nothing is lost, that all things pass and all things remain, that time takes everything and gives everything back, that love is stronger than death because love changes those it touches and change persists even after its cause has vanished. And so the story concludes where it began, in the shop on the corner of the square, where clocks tick their overlapping rhythms, where craftspeople bend over their benches, where customers come seeking repairs and find something more. Where time is honored and moments are precious and life is understood as the gift it is, temporary and priceless, fleeting and eternal, impossible and real. The clockmaker's secret, kept and revealed, hidden and obvious, whispered and shouted, carried in a pocket watch that never winds down, never stops, never needs anything but existence to continue existing, ticking so slowly that it might as well be still, moving so gradually that it might as well be eternal, marking time that is no time. Measuring moments that are all moments, holding in silver and gears and love the proof that consciousness in time, for all its pain and loss, for all its certainty of ending, is the greatest gift the universe has ever given, the opportunity to be here now, aware, alive, experiencing this impossible thing called existence. And that is the secret, that is the answer, that is what Edmund discovered and what the clock proves and what the story tells to all who have ears to hear. Be here, be now, be present, be alive, and in being fully who you are in each moment you are given, you touch something eternal, you become part of something that never ends, you join the great dance of consciousness moving through time. And that is enough, that is everything, that is all there is and all there needs to be, and the clock ticks on.